All right, the 90 minutes is up. I've turned off the burner. I've turned off the timer. And now I'm letting the canner come down to 0 degrees or 0 pounds. As you can see, the little gauge, it's gone down. Now it's just probably about 7 right now. When that gets down to 0, then I'm going to take the weight off, and you can still see it. You can hear it hissing. You can see the steam coming up. If I were to remove that weight right now, because that's the process, you take the weight off and then you undo the lid. So if I were to take that weight off right now where it still has a lot of pressure and there are a lot of steam, what is going to happen, and I'm not going to demonstrate that because it's very dangerous. Number one, I'll be hit with a blast of 240 degree steam all at once. But what it could also do, the inside of the canner is now pretty much a vacuum. When you put that weight on it and it starts, when all the steam has built up, it creates a vacuum, so the lid is really, really sealed. So if I were to suddenly take the weight off, suddenly that would vent it. You would have just a venting of steam, and it could also cause all of the liquid inside the jars to come out. So what happens in the jars and the whole pressure canning process is that the process, it sucks the air out of the jar. And as the jars cool, it's going to create a vacuum effect, and that's what seals the lids down onto the jars. So there will also be some liquid that seeps out. You'll see at the bottom of the canner, where it was water, there'll probably be a little bit of greasy because there will be some broth that does leach out. That's why the directions for canning the stew were to leave an inch of headspace. Just to avoid the liquid from leaching out of the jar. Some of the jars will have some liquid that will have leached out, so the air gets sucked out of it, and so does some of the liquid. So that's just a byproduct of it. That's why when you're pressure canning, most of the directions will have you leave an inch and sometimes 2 inches in the jar to try to prevent that as much as possible. So that's why it's very, very dangerous. So I want to make sure that it's the pressure gauge is down to 0. And even then, I'm going to take that weight, which is very, very hot. I'm going to take it with an oven mitt and just kind of pull it up a little bit. If there's still steam that's hissing out, I'm going to put it back down there. I do not want to take it off until there is no more steam coming out, because number one, I want to avoid a burn, and number two, I want to minimize the liquid loss in the jars, and you'll see when we take it off. Now, on the flip side, you think, well, why not just leave it on and leave everything together for a couple of hours? Well, what's also going to happen is where it is a vacuum now, but I'd be able to take the lid off now. If I were to leave it on and let the whole thing completely cool, I won't be able to get the lid off of the canner without a sledgehammer because of the vacuum effect. Now, I've got my other canner going. You can hear that. That is now starting to vent. I don't know if you can see that on the top. What I did was I took that other jar of stew that didn't fit in the first canner, and I took the potatoes and carrots, cut up another onion, cut up some more celery, and filled several pint jars with the carrots, the potatoes, and the celery and the onions, and heated up the rest of the broth that I had in the pan, and filled up 3 or 4 little pint-sized jars. So, that could be a side dish. They could be opened up together and combined to make a stew. I also can meat individually. Sorry about the light. I'll shut off the overhead light because there we go. That's a little better. I just wanted you to be able to see what I was doing. So that's going to start regularly steaming. I'm going to let that vent for several minutes, and then I'm going to put the weight on. And you'll see that weight, and you'll get to listen to that jiggle as well. So as I was saying, what I did was now I have 3 or 4 pint-sized jars of potatoes, carrots, onions, and celery with some broth, and that'll be canned up, and I'll just put it away. And if I want to make a nice stew or soup or use it in a side dish, then I'll be able to do that. So that's the beauty of canning. You know, you'll have a variety of main dishes, meals, and side dishes at your disposal to use whatever you want. And oftentimes, I will make stews, but oftentimes when I, stock up potatoes are on sale, onions, if I buy in bulk and I don't want anything to go bad, I'll do a canning day and I'll can up several quarts of those veggies, and it's a base for anything. I'll also can up cubed beef. I'll just do several quart jars of the beef. I'll do the same thing with chicken. Most meats you can can. All right, so now you can hear that. That's making a ruckus. And it looks like it's steaming pretty steadily there. So I'm going to set my timer for another 7 minutes. And you'll get to see what that weight looks like. Now, this is the weight. Yeah, it's still steaming. There's a couple of different vents on that canner, so it makes different noises. So this is the weight that I was telling you about that goes on the other one. There's one I can't quite pull it off. There we go. Okay. This right here, this is 5 pounds of pressure. Now on the other one, on my canner, that little dial there, it depends on where in the circle, the way they have it. And I honestly don't know how they set it up, but it's just in that one weight. This one you have separate weights. So this would be 5 pounds of pressure that I would put on that center vent over there, and it would be food items to be canned under 5 pounds. If I put on one set of weights, that's another 5 pounds, so that's 10 pounds of pressure. And this is another ring that I would put on if it was 15 pounds of pressure. So these recipes call for 10 pounds of pressure. So I just have the one ring on. So once that's done venting, then I'll put that on there as well. So when it comes to canning, and I've touched on this overall, safety is key. You want to follow the directions to the letter. Canning is an exact science. You can tweak the recipes and play around with the recipes, and I found recipes that I like, some that I don't like. Follow the recipes to the letter. Be careful about adding spices. If it's a spice that's not in your recipe but you like it, I'd suggest wait until you're ready to heat the jar up for a meal to add the spice. For example, the chili I made last night, which is almost gone. It's really good. It's a chili recipe from the Ball Canning book, and it's one of the best chili recipes I've ever had. I know everybody, says they make the best chili, but this is really good. Not a lot of spices in it. There's some cumin seeds. There's, of course, chili powder, salt and pepper, but that's it. I like to add Kahlua into my chili, which gives it a really nice sweet flavor, a little sweet to go with the heat, and it's really, really good. But I've never canned it with the Kahlua in it, and I don't really want to experiment with it and potentially ruin my chili. And besides, we just keep on eating it, so that's that. So you can also, and I've done this when beef has been on sale, when meats were plentiful, and they will be again. But if you're somebody who, you like to buy a lot of meats and poultry and all that, and some people are able to get, like we go in on a half a cow with one of Joe's coworkers, so we get a lot of meat, a couple of times a year. Or a lot of my friends who are hunters, and they have freezers full of venison and fowl and even bear meat, moose meat. I have some hunters who harvest some really cool things. You can take that meat and you can just can it up. If you don't have any recipes and you don't have time to be cutting up all those vegetables, just cut up the meat and you can can it. You don't have to add anything to it. It'll make its own broth. You take a hot jar, cut up your beef into cubes, or your chicken, or even strips, put it in the jar, and in the pot it goes, as long as the jar is hot. You want to make it really hot so it doesn't explode. As long as the beef, you don't want to put frozen meat into a hot jar and then into a pot of boiling water, because that's going to cause a problem as well. It could explode. Or you could add broth to it, you could add water to it, and you can can it up. So I've also done that. I've canned up pint-sized jars of meat and chicken. So you could pretty much put together any possible combination of meat and vegetables, or poultry and vegetables, and make up a stew, and then just add whatever you would add to your recipes. Again, go light on the spices, because you probably won't really taste them. You'll have to add them when you heat up the dish. Now, I will say, when it comes to canning up meat and poultry and just beef, you get a really inexpensive chuck roast, you cut it up, you throw it in the jar, you get several pints or quarts or whatever, or you cut up a chicken and can it. You can can it with the bones, you can bone it out and can the breast and the other meat. What I tend to do, if I have bones, like beef bones or chicken bones, I save them in a freezer bag and I use them to make a stock. So you want to get as much as possible. You don't want to let anything go to waste, and you can use those bones. I have beef bones that I'll use and make bone broth until they fall apart and they crumble, because they're so soft and there's nothing left. Especially if they have marrow in them, that's what gives you all of the wonderful nutrients in your bone broth. Same thing with vegetables. That 5-pound bag of carrots that I peeled, I saved the peelings as long as there wasn't any mold or anything yucky on it. I save the peelings. I save onion skins. Even like celery, I'll shave. The back of the celery stalk has those like hairs that get stuck in your teeth. Those long, whatever they are, those veins. I don't like them, and it makes it hard to chop up. And I don't like them getting caught in my teeth. But I'll take a vegetable peeler and I will shave the back of celery stalk, and I will save those shavings and put it all in a freezer bag. So I have in my freezer, I have bags of bones, and I have bags of vegetable skins and vegetable peelings, because I'll use that and I'll make a stock, and then I'll throw out the vegetable peelings. And the chicken bones I'll use once, but the beef bones, the real thick ones, meaty bones, I'll use those multiple times. So my timer is about to go off, and I'm going to put the weight on it. And now, as you can see, I hope you can see the steam. I'm sure you can hear it, but I'm going to take, and I pop that on there. So that's what it looks like. It's going to whistle, and then what that's going to do is that's going to start rocking. And that's what I'm going to set my timer at, 90 minutes. So in that pot, I have 1 quart jar, and I have several pint jars. So if you're going to be canning different size jars, the different size jars, the quart jars, they're canned for an hour and a half. Pint jars are an hour and 15 minutes. So you can can different size jars together, and even little, if I had like a little jelly jar full of broth or something, you would want to set your timer for the largest jar. So it doesn't mean the vegetables are going to get overdone, because it's an additional 15 minutes. But for safety reasons, the whole thing is going to go for 90 minutes once it starts rocking. So when it comes to canning, oftentimes the lids will pop, they'll seal pretty quickly in the process. Sometimes I'll be done, I can hear cans sealing during the canning process, so I know that they've sealed. It's really in the cooling process. But just because that's sealed does not mean it's safe yet. No shortcuts. Do not cut your time short. Don't can if you can't devote really an entire day. It's 4:30 and I've been doing this since 9:30 this morning. Of course, there's been a lot of waiting just to get the canner going and to wait for the process, and now the gauge is almost at 0, so I'll be able to take that off in a minute, take the lid off in a minute. But it's an all-day thing. Don't start it if you can't finish it. Oftentimes what I'll do where there's so much prep work in making a stew and in anything else really, I'll do the prep work the night before, cut up my vegetables, put them in freezer bags, quart-sized bags, bowls. I'll have everything set and ready to go so I can take it out, have it come to room temperature. You know, the vegetables, the meat, you want to leave that in the fridge until it's ready, but just don't freeze anything. You know, so because when they develop this way of canning, because there is such a science to it, they learned that they need to have these jars full of food brought up to a certain level of pressure, 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure, for a certain length of time to kill all the mold, spores, bacteria, anything that is going to spoil the food. So that's why. So no shortcuts. You might hear that lid ping, doesn't mean that it's safe. Let it process the entire time. If, for whatever reason, if there's an emergency and you do have to cut your canning session short, then let everything cool down. You know, put it in the fridge, keep it safe, and then either use it up. You know, if you've got a large group to feed, you can probably do it, use it up within a week or so, or you would actually have to dump out the jars, get new lids, heat everything else up, and pretty much start the process over. So unless it's an emergency, you really want to have all of that time to devote to canning. So it is a time commitment. So when it comes to equipment, you've seen all the stuff I have. I've got a lot of stuff. I've accumulated this stuff over the years. People give me things. I get jars. So I have quite a collection. The lids and the rings, I'll buy them new. I've gone through my rings. I've thrown out a couple that are rusty. I'm not going to mess around with that. So you're going to have to restock your stuff. But really, you might have to buy some new jars. Here and there, and they're very, very cheap for a dozen jars, especially the end of the summer when it's harvest time. Everybody's buying them. You know, if they're on sale, get them. So, you know, of course, there's the canner, the water bath canner, the one I used yesterday, that black one that looks like the lobster pot. That's I think that's $20, maybe $20. And you can use it for other things. I don't really like cooking in it because it's not a heavy duty pot. And it usually has a metal rack sitting in it. So it's not something I cook in, but it's there at least. The pressure canners, your basic pressure canner, which will do up a batch of quart jars, that's about $78, $80. That's a really nice one. And then the prices go up from there. I know my All-American canner, that was pretty expensive because, you know, because I do a lot of canning. It's a heavy duty canner, but that's also a really big one. They have littler ones there. You know, and the other one I have, I don't know how much it is, but I'm just going to show you. See how that's rocking? So that has come up to pressure. So I'm going to adjust my heat. Set the timer for 90 minutes. Not 9 minutes, 90. Get that going. And the other one, you can see the gauge. It's just above 0. It's not quite there. I'm not going to rush it because I would rather have it be below that line. You know, if I let it sit if I let it go, like sometimes I'll shut it off and then I'll forget. And I'll come back and that's down at 0. How long has it been there? If I were to just leave that and walk away and leave it overnight, then it would be a problem because I'd have to get a crowbar to pry that lid off. And that is no lie. It's really, really stuck. So, you know, I have had people ask me over the years about equipment, and you've seen all my fancy tools. you know, if you can afford them and you have the space for it, you know, the utensils, you definitely need them. And I highly recommend the little magnetic. This is really handy, because otherwise trying to get those little flat lids out of a metal pan that has had boiling water sitting in it and it's on the stove, it's not easy with a fork or with a spatula or anything else. This, you stick it in and you can pull it right out. So, you know, you don't need to go crazy. You know, make sure you get good quality jars, good quality lids and rings. Buy the Ball brand. Avoid the store brand, the Walmart brand, because I don't have good luck with that. They never really hold the seal. Just gonna turn the... All right, so that should be steadily rocking the way it is for the next 88 minutes. And if you were in a small kitchen, I've got a good sized kitchen, but don't have a lot of storage space. A lot of my stuff goes down. I've got shelves in the basement. I've got my pantry down there. It's not ideal because it's a basement and it's kind of damp, so I do have to wash everything when I bring it up. But, you know, it is what it is. You know, food processor, bowls, pots, things like that. You know, so just your basic. You can do this with a minimum of tools. I'm willing to loan out my canner to somebody who wants to use it in my equipment. The utensils, $7 or $8, you know, to get the jar lifter. That stuff I do, it is necessary to get those utensils, to get the spatula, the headspace tool, the funnel, and the jar lifter. That you do want to invest in. And I usually keep my utensils stored in one of my canners, although this last time I didn't, after a class that I taught, and then I couldn't find them until I bought another set, then I found them. So, you know, if you have a food processor, great, that makes meal prep, you know, go by. But when it came to the vegetables, I had a paring knife and a really good chef's knife and a cutting board, and that's what I did. I used that. So you don't need a whole lot of tools. You don't need a whole lot of space. You will need space to store your canner. You want to be very careful, like the canner itself. It's mine are really heavy duty. They're pretty solid. If I were to drop the pots, I'd better pray I don't drop them on my feet, because that'll break every bone in my foot. The lids they're more delicate. They're very sturdy, but the lids, the way they're fit, they're engineered to fit that way. And the gauges, if you drop your lid, especially one that has a gauge, my big one, the Dalek, that I call it because it looks like something out of Doctor Who. If I were to drop that and it were to land on its gauge, I wouldn't want to use it again, because it might screw up the calibration. And if that's not calibrated correctly, then I could have very poor outcomes. So the gauge actually does come off. And what I would do is I would most likely send it, like the county extension office. There's actually places that you can send your canning tools, and sometimes these county extension offices, they do exist. You know, every state's got one. You know, you can actually look them up online, and they often have classes, they have resources, they have, and they can actually, they can help you with your equipment, they can answer questions. Although I think my American canner, if my gauge, if I was questioning it, if it seemed like it was off, then I could actually send it to them, and they could either recalibrate it for me or get me a new one. So, you know, that's it for the equipment. So take care of your equipment as much as you can. So when I had mentioned earlier, there are certain things that you can't can or shouldn't can. And they really make sense. You want to avoid canning milk. I know that there's a process. There's like sweetened condensed milk, evaporated milk. There's those products there that are cheap enough to get at the store. If you can milk because you're exposing it to high heat for a long period of time, it's going to seriously change the color, the texture. It's nasty. There are some recipes that do use dairy, it could change the texture and the taste of that. So if you have a recipe that you're wondering about, just look, follow if there's a dish that does involve dairy, see if you can find the cannibal version of that particular dish. Something like hummus or peanut butter is not recommended to can those. I don't know if the heat has any impact on them, but the reason why is because they're very, very thick. If you think about, especially peanut butter, and what you need when you're canning is, no matter how the size of the jar, the heat needs to penetrate to the center of the food product. It's got to get to everything in the jar equally. And if you have something like peanut butter and the heat can't get to the center of that mass of goo, of peanut butter, you run the risk of not killing all of the bacteria, and you could end up with a bad case of food poisoning. You could can something and think it's okay and it smells okay, and then you're going to end up with food poisoning. Although it's pretty easy to figure out if something's not okay. This morning I ran downstairs to get a couple of jars, and I was looking for something else in my cupboard, and I had canned up a jar of carrots a couple of years ago. I had canned up some carrots, and the seal had come undone on one of them. It didn't smell yet. Carrots, I guess they don't stink if they get bad, but there was quite the thick layer of mold on the top, and it was looking pretty nasty. So when I saw that, I pressed it, and sure enough, the lid just didn't seal. And I just threw the whole jar out. Depending on what it is, you can, if you want to save your jar, you would have to throw out the lid, but I just didn't even want to bother. I just tossed it out. And that's something that a lot of people will recommend, is that if it's bad, when in doubt, just throw the whole thing out, because now you've got mold that's formed in that jar, and even though you're cleaning it, you're still going to be questioning it. So what I want to show you, so those are really the big three: hummus, peanut butter, and dairy products. All right, so what I want to show you, this is, it's just a jar and a lid. How you can tell when the seal is proper, when it's sealed and it's good. We had seen the little bubbles in the middle of the lid. If you try to get this at an angle where it's not going to reflect light, if you can hear that, and you can see I'm able to make little indents in the jar. Now, a jar that is sealed, take the jelly, I can't press that. That is solid. There's no give to it. So that's a sealed jar. And you can see there's like a little dimple in the jar. Now, when it comes to the jelly jars, the jelly canned up beautifully. If anybody wants some strawberry jelly, I got several jars here. You're willing to have it. I recommend, because sometimes in the canning process stuff gets mixed up. Sometimes the sugar concentrates in one area of the jar, so just stir up the jam to make sure you're not getting like a mouthful of sugar, which is pretty gross. So then, the jelly, I washed all the jars, took the rings off, washed the rings. These are now ready for storage. You'll notice I have the little labels on it. One thing you do want to do is label your canned goods, because stuff can look alike, and if you're not sure what the meat is in there, you really don't want to play guessing games. So, get a label. These are really cheap. Or what you can do is you can just take a Sharpie. You can just take a Sharpie or a marker, and you can write it right on the lid. Forgive my horrible handwriting, but that's strawberry jam. You put what's in it and what the date is. And if it's like a low sugar, if it's a different special diet, you want to write that down as well. All right, so now time to take the lid off this thing. What I'm going to do first, oven mitt, I'm going to take, it's still hissing a little bit, but there was just that little spit, and that was it. Always use oven mitts. So what I'm going to do now And I'm going to do this on opposite ends. Ugh, these are pretty tight. I'll see. I'm hoping this goes sideways. But I'm just going to do like every other, kind of like taking the lug nuts off of a flat tire. Alright, so now, this lid, kind of twist it. So if you see, I don't know if you can see it, that's the little hook that catches underneath there. When you remove the lid, you want to remove it so that you're not opening it towards your face, so that you don't get blasted with a face full of steam. So I'm going to very carefully, and you'll see steam coming up. So I'm just kind of propping the lid on the edge of my sink and looking in the jar. And you can see, looking at the lids, they look a little bit dirty. That's some of the juice, some of the broth that was leached out of the jars in the canning process, and also it looks like it happened during the canning process. So I'm going to let them sit in there. I'm going to set my other timer for 5 minutes. Let them sit there, and then I'm going to take them out. Hopefully they'll start sealing. Looking at the tops, I don't see any of the lids that have sealed, but they will. They'll start to ping, and they should all hopefully ping. Usually they ping for me within the hour, but they don't look too pretty now. But when they come out, and I'll get a picture of it. When they come out, the liquid in there, I can see it. It's boiling. These jars, what's in there, will boil for probably a good hour, because they've just spent the last hour and a half in 240-degree water and steam. So that's some hot stuff in there. Now remember, I had put everything into those jars raw. It's going to be completely cooked when it comes out. So as I was saying before I went over there to take the lid off, when it comes to canning beef and chicken and things like that, oftentimes, if you've ever had canned chicken from the store, it's got kind of a texture to it, it's got a taste. It's not one I'm really fond of. And the same thing, I've canned up ground beef. Now, just FYI, a pound of ground beef, if you can that up, it'll fit in a pint jar. And I'm actually going to kind of stand over here because I can hear them starting to ping. So they're starting to seal, which is, to a canner, that's the best sound in the world. It means it worked. And nothing went wrong. So if you just ground up, if you can ground beef, if you can stew beef, if you just throw stuff in the jar raw, and that term is actually called raw pack. There's raw pack and there's hot pack. Hot pack is where everything's hot, everything's heated, the meat's cooked, you got a hot broth over it. Raw pack is throwing in raw meat. That's